June 6, 1984, President Reagan broadcast from the renowned Normandy sites, saluting the soldiers' heroic efforts 40 years before. The president captured my undivided attention. By the end of the battle to free Normandy, my father would forever rest in the historic grounds above the beach. The next year, in Frederick, Maryland, a lovely memorial was unveiled in tribute to the soldiers in Frederick who fought in the war, my father included. The service deeply stirred me. Returning late on a jet to Seattle, I stared through the small airplane window, looking from 25,000 feet into vast darkness. An empty blankness enveloped me. Then far in the distance, a star offered a tiny speck of light, and thoughts flickered on. Where? When? How? I began to read about World War II. I had learned some things when Mother made short comments. Then she'd stop, and we respected her silence. But reading through 86 and 87, in 1988, an opportunity arrived. With help from the outstanding American Battle Monuments Commission, my husband Terry and I traveled to the Normandy American Cemetery. On a cliff above Omaha Beach, we walked into the 172 acres. To plot A, I found row 7, and then cross 41, my father's memorial. An emotional baptism rose from deep in my heart. 44 years of not crying about my father, I sobbed. But soon I started to look at the cross, CMBT, COMB, had no idea. And I read the date he died. I had never known. I walked past crosses all perfectly aligned. Very little in life is perfect. But the 9,386 individual memorials are erected in perfect alignment. The sun shining on the white marble, brighter than sun on fresh snow, gave brief details. To comprehend the ferocious horror which brought these men forever to an immaculate, beautiful place, it's difficult to understand. The quiet serenity defies the brute hatred that led to this lovely memorial. Providence guided me. Years of not asking about my father, I asked the superintendent in the center if it was possible to find any material on the unit on Daddy's cross. He nodded, and finally, after looking, handed me a sheet of paper. Write to Mr. Russell Lamson. As soon as we arrived home, I wrote to Mr. Lamson in Pennsylvania. He offered to help and enter a short request in the Hell on Wheels Journal of the Veterans. The seminal lines in the quarterly publication started my incredible journey, 30 years of finding Daddy. In just weeks, phone calls came, letters arrived. The gentlemen of the 2nd Armored Division, without hesitation or reservation, reached out. The resources they offered, remarkable warm humor, opened a new world for me. The fellows directed me to specific books on the division, sent photos of Robert they had kept all those years, and discussed in detail where the division bivouacked during the war. One letter included a copy of Robert's orders for active duty. He left his position with the Soil Conservation Agency and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and went to Fort Benning, Georgia. The copy of the reserve officer's orders came from Fort Meade, Maryland, and this developed because of the Selective Service Act that was enacted on September 16, 1940, the first time in U.S. history there had been conscription of soldiers. Robert's duty began December the 8th, 1940. at Fort Benning, Georgia, under General Patton. He required vigorous maneuvers in Tennessee, Louisiana, the Carolinas, because he had to strengthen the nascent 2nd Armored Division. He knew the U.S. was not ready for battle. In 1939, when war began, the United States ranked 18th in the world, after Portugal. Earlier, in June 1937, at Fort Knox, Kentucky, Robert, in a reserve officer session, witnessed Adolf von Schell, a Nazi, who was on an inspection tour in the U.S. He was inspecting mechanized cavalry, the current name in 37 for the armor. He was not impressed. Well, years ahead, the 16,112,566 Americans in uniform did impress. Along with veterans, Dr. Bridgman, a history professor at the University of Washington, gave a lecture in 1990 on U.S. action in 1940. Each year, he did a lecture until 1995 for the 45 win. 700 crowded into his lecture hall, and many of them senior citizens. They asked specific questions about the wartime. This benefited me greatly and reassured me. Others wanted to remove the silence. Along with the 2nd Armored Men and the UW lectures, I talked with a good friend, Dr. Julie Eulenberg, whose father was killed in the Pacific. And she said that Ann Mix wanted to create a network for persons whose father was killed in the war. I went up to Bellingham, Washington to meet Ann. We chatted and stayed connected. My major interest was with the veterans. Several veterans discussed their fight for Sicily. During the Casablanca Conference in Morocco in 1943, the British required that the battles start in the Mediterranean, start in Sicily, and they ensued with our soldiers, 66,285 U.S. soldiers, in a secondary role. So in June 1991, Terry and I went to Sicily. We drove south where the July 43 battle began from a very stormy, sickening sea. The CCB unit that my father was in started first and made an amphibious landing while being strafed by German airplanes. But after their win, the veterans emphasized some of the division settled at the Zucco Villa. So we found the historic villa. Prince Michael, son of the King of France, had in the 1800s established the Grand Villa. I walked among the olive trees and lemon trees and then entered the great but slightly decreasing villa because none of the royalty had remained present. Terry called for me to see a huge wine cellar facility. The Duke, in the 1800s, had established vineyards to produce Muscat wine. I listened to veterans describe the amount of Muscat wine they consumed in 1943. They said, 5,000 gallons. Well, that's like a fishing tale that exaggerates each year. But joining Terry, their statements appeared correct. The troops did empty the immense wine casks containing 500 gallons, and then more of them containing 100 gallons of the stored sweet wine. After grueling weeks of war and terrifying fear, the GI's time in Sicily turned to terrific fun. Robert wrote saying that he had captured alone a garrison with 33 men and 2 officers, but he lost 10 pounds off his slim frame in 12 days. Then he stated, "Well, the first week was a bit rugged." A bit rugged? Quite an understatement. From the African Scirocco winds against Sicily, heat of 100 degrees pressed the soldiers in full uniform with metal helmets, loaded with equipment, crossing the narrow ridges of Sicily. Along with the extreme heat, the soldiers breathed in volcanic ash, and far worse, horrific, overbearing stench struck them. Sicily produces 95% of the world's sulfur, and that stench, along with malaria striking so many of them, was more than a bit rugged. The award-winning epic movie of Patton missed most of the raucous GI's actions, and in no way can the movie theater hold repulsive stench of sulfur or choking volcanic ash. Patton did request his troops capture the capital, Palermo, in 5 days. They won in 4 days. When the GIs finished the battle, shortly before Montgomery's troops arrived, the Americans would never again be assigned second role. The 2nd Armored shipped out the first week of November. Passing Gibraltar, on toward the Azores, the excited troops expressed certainty they'd be home for the holidays. They'd been overseas in Morocco and then in Sicily for a year. Yeah, they'd go home. Thanksgiving Day, the ships docked in Liverpool, England. Home was delayed. Well, Christmas in merry old England, under strict blackouts and severe rationing, allowed troops still to have incredible fun. An article was written and then made into a book, Overpaid, Oversexed, Over Here. But aside from that, the 2nd Armored fellows believed Christmas is for children, and they gave parties for orphans. Because in 1939, facing German bombing, little children were removed from their homes. They were removed from their mothers. A book, written in 1988, No Time to Wave Goodbye, describes the traumas in these tykes. Their mothers killed in bombing, their fathers at war killed. They were full orphans. So, the 2nd Armored GIs gave them a Christmas party with chocolate and little gifts and lots of fun. For Terry and myself, returning to October 1991, the 2nd Armored Division invited me to a reunion in Louisville, Kentucky. Conversations with friends who knew my father so well were really emotional. It was very moving. They would be laughing, and then soon tears rolled down their cheeks in their wrinkled skin. They really had loved him. 1991 also closed in an unexpected program. The Sunday newspapers, through the Parade magazine, invited members to reach Washington, D.C. by December the 8th, because no greater love gave families who suffered the loss of a loved one in World War II an incredible banquet. The chairman, Carmela Laspada, and her board received heartfelt thanks. I felt encouraged to expand visits to England, to France, and then specifically to Northeast Normandy to cover Daddy's path. In 1996, I relished another division reunion, and with rounds of laughter, I recalled George Bernard Shaw's quote, "Life does not cease to be funny when people die any more than it ceases to be serious when people laugh." Besides visits with veterans and reading the Hell on Wheels quarterly journal, that provided personal experience the men endured. Most of all, I learned where and how my father's shortest day arrived. Out from the deadly hedgerows in Normandy, the Allies now moved faster over a rolling section of Normandy. In 2 days, they covered 99 miles in rain and mud. Well, then they ran out of fuel. Their goal was to reach Belgium by September, and journalists were writing that the war might be over before Christmas. The soldiers held such a desire to be home. As the S2 intelligence officer for CCB headquarters, Robert focused on helping his fellow soldiers, his friends, keeping their maps current by the hour. He interrogated recent German prisoners to find out the battle plans. In early afternoon, across the level plains from the woods, a Nebelwerfer rocket holding 6 explosives shot into the space and killed instantly on August 23rd. Robert's service ended. Day was done. Major Lane had served 45 months with the 2nd Armored Division. His Hell on Wheels friends knew him, and in minutes, Sergeant West and Walter Bergeson reached Robert's body, saluted as they wrapped him in an army blanket. Though they mourned his loss, they continued to fight with discipline and determination. The saying, "He gave his life," was not Robert's. He did not give his life. Uncontrolled hatred by Nazis took his fine life. The Normandy Battle was won the next day by August 24th, and a large parade was held in Paris. It was still beautiful because the governor assigned by Hitler, von Koltitz, defied Hitler's orders to totally destroy Paris. The 2nd Armored Division did not parade. They kept moving east to finish the war in Europe. Their victory parade took place on July 4th, 1945, in Berlin. The 2nd Armored Division led the parade and was saluted by President Truman, by Churchill, General Marshall, General Eisenhower, General Patton. They were all beaming as the Benning to Berlin boys marched by in their pressed uniforms. They would have preferred to be in cooler clothes on their way home. Their major interest was home. Yes, home. In 1997, my mother's health failed, and I arranged care for her, and then I needed to empty her apartment. Clearing a dresser drawer, in the bottom drawer was a folder with a stack of forms and a scrapbook and photos. I spent hours absorbing what my mother endured when she received the telegram. In Frederick, Maryland, on a September morning, Mother fixed breakfast for her 2 school-aged children. A knock at the front door. Opening the door, she was handed a telegram. Not a comfortable scene like one has in a movie. The telegram conveyed, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Major Robert A. Lane, was killed in action on 23 August in France. Letter follows." She sobbed. Their 10th wedding anniversary in August 44 became their last. Like a large guillotine blade dropping, the telegram severed their happy marriage. On the back of the telegram envelope, an unacceptable advertisement read, "Money in a hurry. To send it or get it. Telegraph it. Quick and safe. Economical. No red tape." But that afternoon, September 11th, 2 letters arrived. First, from the President. "In grateful memory, freedom lives, and through it, he lives." The second letter, the Adjutant General's office, writing to confirm that the telegram had come. I wish more information was available, but under battle conditions, it's limited. My deepest sympathy. And in a few days, General Marshall extended deep sympathy. His memory will live in the grateful hearts of our nation. In another day, she received a report of burial stating Robert was buried in the St. Andrea combat area 2 days after his death, with an identifying dog tag on the body, and they listed all the personal effects with Robert. Mother received an annual update of his burial in February 46, in April 47, in May 47. A photo was sent of the place of burial in April 48, and then the final considerate notice, June 2nd, 1949. But back in 1944, on October 26th, the Purple Heart letter explained in detail the fine expressions about the Purple Heart and enclosed the beautiful Purple Heart medal, which she saved for my brother. Steady mail of letters, VA forms, insurance settlement, all came in along with his goods. That kept the telegram in the forefront, an unwavering reminder. The settlement of his $10,000 military insurance was finalized February 1st, 1945. Robert's father had been killed when Robert was 11, so he knew it might be possible that his children would become fatherless. Goods, cartons, footlocker trunks arrived, and the quartermaster officers detailed each delivery with letters with a specific date that they would come and listed all that would be coming. Robert's sixth delivery arrived August 25th, 1945, 1 year after his death. And in a decreased size carton, it held $10.79. The quartermaster people were incredible. During these notices, also detailed pension payments were mailed. 2 forms came around Christmas time in 44. Mother's pension amount read $65. Incorrect. She typed a letter to the VA. After 7 months, on March 22nd, 1945, the correct monthly pension was settled at $91 a month, and no pension form ever signed out with sympathy. The pension forms even included a paragraph on punishment for fraud. Severe penalties involving fines and imprisonment provided by the United States laws for any intent to defraud. My mother was incredibly honest. She couldn't defraud. Through all the VA notices, forms, and goods, Mother kept our home and family functioning. Her mother had sadly died in 1942. She had no family in Frederick, Maryland with her. Seeing Robert's idle car, she learned to drive a stick shift car. In mid-July 1944, all 3 of her children developed critically ill whooping cough. My sister and I were hospitalized with it, and Mother suffered, but she continued on. And blackouts made her long, lonely nights even worse. Living near Washington, D.C., very strict blackouts were imposed. And some places burned wet oil and tires to create thick black clouds. And of course, the wind blew that away from any camouflage. Labels disturbed Mother. She received forms addressed to unremarried widow. The label even appeared out on a public envelope. She understood that this was part of the pension office category. However, the term unremarried is not in our vocabulary. She didn't deny that she was a widow, though she never wore black. No black. But she detested that label at a time when a single parent was a stigma. The label orphan also disturbed her. She was an exemplary parent in an era of father knows best. She was excellent. Yes, war orphan status existed, had for over a century, 2 centuries, but that was a label that benefited the pension office status, not the way we were. From 1940, Robert was away almost all the time, and in late 1942, he wrote to his children before he sailed overseas. Mother had placed my letter in the scrapbook. My dear Sandra, I know a little girl who is not 2 can't read, but perhaps you will be old enough to read when I see you again. In the army, I had to go away. I believe I could have taught you to say Daddy. I hope I get to see you again before so very long, and then we can get acquainted. As ever, Daddy. And in March 1943, from North Africa, he had one of his men draw a birthday card for me. There's no Hallmark store there. Perhaps I will be able to see you by your next birthday. My circuitous route to follow Daddy's service advanced from his memorial across the U.S., around Europe, until in 2016, at another 2nd Armored reunion at Fort Benning, I moved in reverse from my father's service. I had started at his memorial, and I ended at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he started. When a fellow arrived at Fort Benning, he entered a whole different world. Leaving his county for the first time in a friendly farm town where he waved for friends, he'd now made a snap salute to someone he didn't even know in the hierarchy. Instead of bib overalls and a ball cap, he wore a uniform with a metal helmet. And instead of Mom's cooking, he ate in a large mess hall. Immeasurable changes struck the men. While at Fort Benning, I sat in the tight confinement of Sherman tank. During war, 5 soldiers were cramped into that noisy vehicle with human odors and with the smell from the gasoline, 5-gallon gasoline containers in the tank. And seeing out was quite limited. The soldiers had referred to tanks as rolling coffins. Radically different was the first location for battle in Morocco, North Africa. Strange Arabic and Berber talk, 5 calls to prayer, camel caravans. The 15,000 American soldiers resided in a large cork oak forest north of Rabat. They had no electricity, no running water, no toilets, and they slept on cold sand because Morocco is not at the equator. Actually, the Moroccan high Atlas Mountains can be dusted by snow. Each new location required coping and adapting by the soldiers, and they used humor to find enjoyment. So whether in Morocco, Sicily, France, Belgium, one thing the guys wanted for their comfort was fresh eggs. Going through France at a farm, they would buy a fresh egg for 8 cents. It was more tasty than their K rations. The U.S. soldiers pushing through new territory crossed many historic areas. They passed Roman ruins in Morocco, Greek temple ruins in Sicily, Old Salisbury near Stonehenge, the Tower of London, and so on. They regarded these historic places, but they focused on freedom. The American soldiers remained modest about creating history in the middle of the 20th century. The publisher of Time magazine, Henry Luce, coined the title, The American Century. The United States' generosity and the soldiers not striving to be dominant or establishing an empire liberated a nation and moved on. I've developed wonderful close friendships with women who as children endured the horrific World War. Maria, under Nazi horror in Greece, suffered. Lily suffered against the Japanese cruelty in the Philippines. Ruth, surviving in Germany, is a dear friend. Joan Kobayashi, cruelly housed in a concentration camp in Idaho. There are more such friends. None asked for empathy, and they expressed gratitude for my father fighting. As Winston Churchill exclaimed, "Never have so many owed so much to so few." My second armored tours in 1999 and again in 2004 from England, France, and across Belgium and into Germany, during several excellent tributes and ceremonies to the veterans in places that the GIs had liberated, I witnessed the modesty of the triumphant warriors, clad in comfy tourist attire and wearing the white second armored ball caps. They accepted the ceremonies with no pomp expressed. In contrast, British and European fighters wore a formal blazer bedecked with medals with a broad ribbon and struck a pose of superiority. The Americans recognized cultural differences and respected this, but they didn't change their attitude, keeping their relaxed modesty while they were showered with grateful, beautiful appreciation. Along with trips, I had the pleasure to become good friends with others dedicated to remembrance. Jean-Marc Lejeune, through the Memorial Association of France, adopted Robert's grave. He attended Daddy's grave on his birthday, on Memorial Day, and on other times that he visited the cemetery. And he remembers soldiers in British cemeteries. Because of his dedication, in 2005, my husband and I contributed sufficient funds for the French Association members to place bouquets at the crosses that are carved with "Known but to God." These need remembrance. Any identity is eradicated. They have no recognition. The members adopted the 307 crosses known but to God at the Normandy American Cemetery and those at the St. James Cemetery. A dedicated French teacher, Krista Zucolato, created a program for her students to research, write, and then visit a memorial. The book they created for us in remembrance of Daddy's service is excellent. And they continued in other years. She had her students locate more individuals. She even had them attend the cemetery on June 6th. The government of the United States and of the French government have recognized her and honored her for exceptionally fine teaching of this important history. Another cemetery in Normandy is observed, a large German cemetery, and there's more than one German cemetery. For A1 members, 4 of them are featured in the Lacombe German book, which is stating, "Learn from the past for the future." The book has a brief, heartfelt story by Kathleen Eaton, Jack Forgy, Donna Pyle, and myself, Sandra, from A1. Walking through the German cemetery, the black basalt markers are a stark contrast with the white Carrara marble in the American cemetery. Lacombe has 1/3 listed as unknown, and usually there are 3 buried to a black gravestone on the ground. Though Robert received remembrances, our family believes the veterans who continued fighting with determination until the enemy was destroyed deserve extensive remembrance. many of the soldiers suffered physically and psychologically. And this makes the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. even more vital. And the important teacher conferences are crucial in helping the history be known. Just this past year, in November 21, the Smithsonian Magazine had a gripping story about the righteous defiance of Mendes, who covered his accomplishments through severe risks to save Jewish refugees. It made me connect with the King of French, Morocco, who refused in the 1940s to allow his Jewish subjects to go to Nazi death camps. A book this past year, Facing the Mountain, True Story of the Japanese American Heroes in World War II by Daniel J. Brown, was released. It's a heartfelt, excellent, detailed book of American soldiers suffering. Although there's also a lot of excitement in it. The modest American combat soldiers are embedded in American history. The Allied win in the World War dominates 20th century and rests forever in world history. While important material on World War II continues to unfold, I know locating any more information or details on my father is unlikely. During a couple weeks in Morocco, I had visited the ancient Roman ruins of Volibulus, a key city of merchants. Preserved from those centuries are mosaics which tell the story of the families who lived there. As I studied mosaic details, I noticed a few pieces missing of the original, and then I grasped the reality. My father's story lacks a few details, and yet many important pieces to his involvement in a historic time are saved. I accept I'll never hug him. I'll never listen to his adventures in the war. I'll never hear his voice. Thank you for listening. And now, some questions if you like.